Well, let's just dive right in. I'll first start off with a little bit of background on me. I think that might help. So I've been working in admissions for 14 years almost, and trained in UC Berkeley. What started this whole journey for me when I left Google in 2012 was I noticed two things. I think one, students didn't really have a way of kind of discovering themselves. And so that's kind of like one big reason why I started Ready Edge Go in the first place. And then the other part of it was just there's just a huge amount of stress. Over the years, as I've been guiding students across a whole bunch of topics, course selection, just year after year after year, tends to be the one thing. And we work a lot with Fremont Unified now, Irvington High School being one of our major partners, and the counselors say the same. To the point where they've talked about parents, like following the principal to the bathroom, requesting additional APs. So it's been crazy, I think, for not just, I think advisors like ourselves, but certainly schools that deal with it. And so hopefully today with better information, I think we can all reach, I think, clarity of mind. I think it's really key. And also if you can share that clarity with your friends, I think that's, a big push that we're trying to make in the community. And so I'm going to get started with some of the things that I've learned along the way, not just working in missions at UC Berkeley, but also, working with students who've gone across, all the states, the Johns Hopkins to Harvard's to, the CSU system and everything in between. I've seen what works, I've seen what doesn't. Hopefully today we'll go over the mistakes that people typically make, and how to avoid those mistakes too. So yeah, without further ado, I'm going to go and share my screen with a couple of things. I think first thing I'm going to share is just the basics of, like, how GPA is calculated, what really matters. When we think about course selection, we can't not talk about GPA and A to G. So what I'm not going to go over are the A to G requirements for those in state in California applying to UC. But what I will go over is some of the nuances with regards to the UC GPA calculation, as well as some of the myths that kind of surround it. One thing, for instance, is to pay specific attention to, right, is the myth that, oh, only 10th and 11th grade 10th and 11th grade classes count, and that's not true, right? In fact, if you look at the text here, you'll see that the classes taken in the summer after ninth grade and the summer after 11th grade also count, right? So there's a little bit of nuance there worth noting. It's also worth noting that at UC and many universities across the United States, including privates and out-of-state publics like Michigan, or privates like Stanford, we look at multiple GPAs, right? So the first thing is we don't look just at the UC GPA. We look at cumulative weighted GPA across all grades. We also look at cumulative unweighted GPA across all grades. So I think there's often this assumption that colleges only look at one GPA, when in actuality we look at many to determine basically the full picture on a student's academic performance, if you will. And yeah, I think that one of the big things that we'll talk about today is the UC GPA calculation, right? What does it mean, right? How do we max our weightage points? But what happens after that, really? And so, how do we make sense of this in terms of how many APs do I have to take? How many, what is too much? What is too little? Right. But just understand that, a student for the purposes of the UC GPA calculation, they can earn a maximum of 8 weightage points, and each point comes from a semester of a weighted course. So for instance, if I'm in 10th grade and I'm taking, let's say, a UC approved honors weighted course like AP World History, which is a very common 10th grade weighted course, for each semester of that class, I get 1 extra point, right? And so AP World History in the 10th grade would give me 2 weighted points out of my maximum of 8 towards the UC GPA calculation. So quick math there. Obviously, if you take if you get 4 points out of 4 semesters, or in other words, two full year classes, and I take another two weighted courses in the 11th grade, right? So that'd be 4 honors points, right? One for each semester in the 10th grade and 4 honors points for the 11th grade. And I've reached my maximum extra point count for the UC GPA, right? So for instance, if I were to take more, so if I were to take additional APs like, let's say AP language, AP Lang, or an AP calculus AB, an AP physics, an AP chemistry, I cannot earn more than the maximum 8 points toward my UC GPA calculation, right? So this is really important to note, especially if you're a California resident applying for UC, because if you keep adding more and more APs or weighted courses, it doesn't add value or inflate your UC GPA. However, and this is a very important point, going back to the fact that we look at multiple GPAs when we read for university, um, it does add to your cumulative weighted high school GPA, right? Which actually takes your ninth grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade courses, right? And for some colleges, they'll even wait for your first semester 12th grade grades, right? And I'm sure some people here have heard about the waitlist process, and that's when a college basically doesn't accept you, doesn't reject you, doesn't defer you. They just basically say, hey, you're now on the wait list. All that means is we liked your candidacy, but not enough to give you a clean acceptance. So remain on the wait list or accept your position if you want it, and we'll let you know if there's a spot that opens up. And long story short, so that first semester of 12th grade can actually count as well, towards the GPA. Why does all this matter? So how does all this matter, towards course selection? Well, it's finding the right balance, right? Between how do I get as many A's as possible, but also how do I challenge myself appropriately? And when I say appropriately, I think it means in line with, the things that I like and the things that I'm capable of thriving in and getting A's in, right? So that's the key. Couple of quick things, right, before we move on is, when we look at, let's say, like a UC Berkeley student profile, freshman student profile. This is obviously the most competitive UC, right? Neck and neck with UCLA. So let's look at what their expectations are when it comes to GPA, because where we're going to go to after this is talking about course rigor, because so much of course selection comes down to selecting APs or honors, and also this growing talk about how many additional do I need to take outside of school, right? So before we get to that, let's look at Berkeley's own expectations by the numbers, right? So by the numbers, their middle 50% of students in the 2024 admit class had an unweighted range of 3.89 to 4.0, right? I'll do the math for you. 3.89 just means that a student got around 4 to 5 Bs throughout all of high school. This unweighted GPA here is referring to not the UC GPA, it's referring to their high school cumulative GPA, right? So a 3.89, in order to get to Berkeley, in other words, you do not need an unweighted GPA 4.0. I've had students get into UC Berkeley without a clean 4.0, right? Out of, affluent neighborhoods and all kinds of neighborhoods, right? So that's immediately the first myth I want to dispel, right? You do not need to be perfect in order to get into such tier one type schools like Berkeley, right? Obviously, many students do have an unweighted 4.0, right? And they got into UC Berkeley. So it doesn't hurt, right? But it's not the end of the world if you don't have all A's. Now, if you continue to look at the math, right? 4.31 to 4.65, right? This is the cumulative weighted GPA, right? Again, this is not the UC GPA, right? So what if you basically reverse math of the 4.3 to 4.65, all that means is there's a total weighted course count of anywhere between 7 to 14. I'm going to repeat that. Berkeley, the most selective University of California, right, generally takes the middle 50% of students with a total weighted course count across all grades of high school, 9, 10, 11, and even 12th, between 7 and 14. Okay. Now, I want to juxtapose this against a number we kind of hear, a lot, which is what? I heard that a student has to take 14 APs. Well, let me clear that up for a moment, right? It's not 14 APs that a college expects. It's actually, in my opinion, total weighted coursework across all of high school. So that includes honors classes. That is not an AP, but is a weighted class. And so if a student takes English 9 honors, for instance, right, that counts as a weighted class, right? It may not be UC honors approved, but it is a weighted class. So if you think about it, right, 7 to 14, let's go high side. Let's say it's 14, right? That's the 75th, right? In this current look. 14 generally averages about, if you just roughly speaking divide that by, let's say, 4 years of high school, right? That's roughly speaking 3 weighted courses per year. And that's exactly what we've seen students get into Berkeley with. They typically average anywhere between 3, 4, maybe 5 in those latter years, but typically it's around 3 or 4 weighted courses per year, right? So what does this mean then? This means that a student doesn't have to take 5 or 6 APs to qualify for Berkeley, okay, each year. In fact, it's not even the APs, it's actually total weighted count per year. And I like to come back to this as a basic because so many schools, high schools, don't allow you to take APs in the ninth grade. And many of them restricted to maybe 1 or 2 in the 10th grade. So, I think there's tends to be this kind of parent, this rush, right? This fear that, oh my gosh, if my student can only take one AP, like AP World in their 10th grade, or if they can only take 2, I have to catch up. I have to take another 2, right? In addition to my existing coursework. And that is not true, right? University of California, Berkeley, Purdue, right? UIUC, even Ivies, they compare you to your peers and what was available to you in your curriculum at your school. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't take additional coursework. You can, right? Through UC Scout, through community college, through a whole host of A to G publishers. But the baseline is this. The truth is, the sweet spot is usually if your student is a strong student, meaning they have the habits, they have the discipline, they have the self-motivation, right? They have the capability and the will, that they're usually the best sweet spot of total weighted courses any year is anywhere between 3 and 4. 5, I would say, is on the high side, and we'll talk about what that means later. Meaning, I think you start losing time for for rest and also the other qualitative things you need to be a strong candidate. And so, in case you have questions, I recommend dropping them in the Q&A. That would be great, or in the chat. You can also save them for the end. Today, we'll make sufficient time to answer any questions you guys have. And so, anyway, let's move on. Let's actually take a look at one last thing before we go into to the slides. We looked at UC Berkeley, right? UC Berkeley's weighted range was 4.3 to 4.65. And again, that generally equates to a total weighted course count of 7 to 14 for all 4 years, right? If we look at Davis, right, we'll see that their weighted range is lower, right? So Berkeley was 4.3 to 4.6. Davis is 4.0 to 4.26, right? So all this means is that obviously Davis's thresholds are lower in terms of unweighted GPA cumulative, right? So maybe instead of having, 4 or 5 Bs, Davis is willing to work with students who have, let's say, 8, right? Maybe 8, 9 Bs or something like that, right? And fewer weighted courses, right? So, but I just wanted to demonstrate the range here. They still expect students to challenge themselves, right? Again, this is weighted, so this is not unweighted. If this were kind of an unweighted equivalent, I'd say it's roughly speaking probably like 3.6 to, again, this is the middle 50, 3.6 to 3.9, right? Is what I would imagine the typical middle 50 of a UC Davis presenting. So let's get into some of the basics. I was going to demonstrate the scatter plot for Berkeley, but this is not that important or relevant anymore, but it's just fun to see. If you're interested in what this even means, let me know or let us know in the Q&A. I can come back to this during the Q&A. It's kind of fun to look at sometimes. But let's dive into the nuts and bolts of today. So the solution to course selection, right? If I were to kind of just summarize it with 4 simple points, right? It's students should take coursework that allows them to get A's. Right? I'm not talking about, oh, is a B in an AP class the same as an A? No, I'm talking just straight, give me A's, right? You can't go wrong with higher GPA. That's irrefutable, right? And that I want to slow down here. This goes back to the age-old question. Is it better to get a B in an AP or is it better to get an A in a non-weighted class, a regular class? And the truth is, if it's truly one-to-one, my favorite answer is neither, right? Because I'd say it's better to get an A in the AP. But if it's truly one-to-one, I'd rather see a student get an A in the regular. Why? Because at the end of the day, an A is an A and a B is a B, right? If I'm UC Berkeley, if I'm Purdue, and I'm reading an engineering candidate with a B in AP calculus, and an A in a regular calc, another candidate with an A in a regular calc, I'm sorry, the student with an A in the regular calc class draws less doubt for me, especially as an engineering candidate, right? It's a very simple example, right? But the first rule is so important here, right? Just how do I position myself or my student to thrive, not survive, right? When I think about a student in BC territory, they're treading water. But if they're getting A's and, they're positioned to do that, even if that means slightly lower or less weightage, right? That's much better than this weird situation of what I call Rocky Road transcript, right? A's, B's, maybe C's and D's, right? Um, the second point here is just, yeah, have weighted courses along a student's interests, right? Why? Well, if a student likes writing and reading, right, then sure, that's usually a very good sign that they're going to do well. They're going to be motivated to put in the work, right? They're going to form a strong relationship with their teacher, right? And they're going to probably do better in a class like Honors English 10 or AP Lang, right? But if a student genuinely is not interested in something, it's going to take you 3 times longer to motivate that student to do the work. They're certainly not going to do any extra. And I think we all know what happens when a student is not that motivated to do a weighted course that requires more work. They just end up not doing so well, right? And so we'll look at that in a second, right? But the last 2 points here are important. We tend to think about course selection in vacuum, meaning like, oh, yeah, my student can handle this. And you hear students say that all the time too. They say, oh yeah, my friend did this and they said it's easy, right? Well, first of all, your student is not another student. Your student is your student. There's only one of them. And secondly, just because a student can get an A in all these classes doesn't mean that they should do all those classes. Because why? There's other things that colleges look for. I would argue over 50% of some colleges' evaluation criteria has nothing to do with their course selection. It has to do with activities, quality attributes, leadership, persistence, right? Service to the community. And also this last part here, right? We oftentimes think about our kids as machines. They're not. They're human beings, right? They're not human doings. They're people, right? They're growing people, and people need rest, right? We spend a third of our life sleeping. There's a reason for that. We need it. But I see again, we see a lot of students who don't follow some of these rules, and it leads to deteriorating health, right? But if I were to just really kind of summarize, if you just remember one slide from today or one thing today, it's this slide. The further you go away from this slide, the greater chance you start dropping your GPA, the greater chance your student starts, suffering mental health or worse, worse sleep, right? The greater chance your student has less time for other non-academic activities, whether it's to explore their interests or to build things like leadership, right? We start living out of balance, and then all of a sudden, this happens, right? And we see this so often, right? That students take too many APs, and that includes courses that they're taking on at school. That also includes courses that they're taking outside of school, right? They start getting Bs, sometimes Cs, hopefully not worse, but yeah, happens, right? Lowers their GPA. What does that force this parent to do? Have to hire tutors, right? Which costs nowadays quite a lot of money, right? Students then lose time for other classes, right? So what happens when a kid starts tanking in, let's say, like AP Chem or I don't know, let's say AP Lit, right? Obviously, they're pouring all this amount of time to just try to keep that grade afloat, and all of a sudden they don't have the time or the focus for the other classes, and all of a sudden you have this compounding effect, right? And of an even lower GPA. And obviously, all this means just less time for activities, for rest. All of this translates to just lower chances for college, right? So many things happen. It cascades really, like negatively. Qualitative attributes don't get developed. The student's mental health can really be hurt. And so, I think what I find also special attention to, I think outside coursework, which we'll talk about at the end of today, is, probably the worst thing you can do for a student in high school is to say, hey, take more APs outside of class, right? Um, at 14, 15, 16 years old, right? They're already taking six classes. Their brain's already scattered. They go to school for 7 hours. They have probably 3+ hours of homework. And so add on even more coursework. It's really a recipe, right, for disaster, for burnout, right? And again, ultimately, I think lower chances for getting into college, the best colleges for that student, which is not what I think anyone here wants, right? So, what really does matter? To repeat, it's cumulative unweighted GPA and its major related grades. Cumulative unweighted GPA. How do I position my students to get mostly A's? Again, we're not looking for perfect, mostly A's. Right? A's in major related coursework. And if I'm not sure what my kid's going to major in yet, or if I'm a student, I'm not sure what I'm going to major in, that's okay. Just ask your student, what do you find most interesting? What do you find less interesting? Right. At least let's start there, right? If a student's like, well, I really like, math and English, okay, let's how do we position ourselves to get A's in the coursework that you just like? Let's just start with that, right? But if your student is already thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to go health science, right? I want to work in medicine, or maybe I want to go toward business and econ, right? Or something like that. How do I make sure, absolutely sure, my student is getting A's in classes that are related to their major? Right? Because once I don't get those A's in those classes, again, the way a college reads your transcript is dependent on what you're declaring you as your intended major, right? And I know some colleges say that they don't do that. That's fair. But from my experience, right, again, there's only a certain number of seats they have for each department. It is what it is, right? So next is, A's and honors and AP course classes, especially related to the major, right? But again, I think so oftentimes we choose, oh, I heard I need to get course weightage, so I'm going to take more honors and AP classes. But we don't tend to equally emphasize getting A's in those classes. And why? Because parents justify, oh, but I heard getting a B in an honors and AP class is the same as getting an A, and is not true. Okay. Again, the ideal situation is how do I not just take honors in AP classes, how do I get A's in those classes? And lastly, especially since COVID, students have just not been getting fives. I'll just be very frank. I've worked with thousands of students at this point. I don't know what happened, but students are now putting so much emphasis on self-studying for APs or taking more APs, but they're not getting fives in the test. You do not want to put your student in a position where they happen to study for five APs and they're getting threes and fours and everything or worse, right? I'd rather a student, even if they're taking five APs, to get fives on the ones that are related to the major and not even take the AP exams for the other tests, quite honestly. And by the way, whatever your student scores in the AP, they don't need to report on the actual college application. However, just note that an omission can raise more questions than you want, right? If a student, let's say, reports their grades in AP Calculus AB, but does not report an AP exam result because maybe they got a three, that can raise more questions than not. Yeah, obviously less important, right? Is honors and AP classes are just unrelated to a student's interest or their major, right? And this is why oftentimes, and obviously I love history myself, in all forms, world, anthropological, whatever, everything in the middle. But oftentimes we say, unless a student's applying for a poli-sci major, political science, or history major, taking AP US history oftentimes is just really not adding much value to a student's overall profile, right? Especially if they're going STEM, pre-health, engineering, right? Really doesn't do much for you. So, and again, we need more time, right, to do the non-academic stuff too. So remember that. So couple of summary thoughts, right? I would say if you have a student or you are a student who, is an A student, and what I mean by that is this is a student that just has strong foundations. They have strong foundations in knowledge, they have the discipline to learn a lot on their own. They don't need a whole lot of hand-holding or checking on, their accounts to see if they turn their homework in on time. If this sounds like you or one of your students, right, then the sweet spot, I'd argue, is usually right 3 to 4 weighted courses per year when available. Naturally, if you're students in the ninth grade and there's only 2 weighted courses offered, let's say it's accelerated math and English honors, that's fine. But generally speaking, right, the sweet spot is 3 to 4. When you go over 4, I'd argue you start really increasing the risk of getting Bs, and you start really losing time to develop these quality attributes, right? Which is level of learning, demonstrated concern for others, and leadership. And again, even if a student can, so they can take the additional AP, they can take the outside coursework and get an A, right? The cost of that, the opportunity cost of time, in my opinion, and not just as an advisor, but as someone who's read profiles on behalf of UC Berkeley, is too great. They just don't have the time to properly build the profile that they need. Um, if your student, though, is more of a B student, and so naturally there's different sweet spots, right? And everybody is different. But if this sounds more like you or your student, right? We're looking at, and that usually is, identified as someone who's kind of around 3.5, 3.5, 3.7, something like that. Usually it's two weighted courses per year. This still keeps you in the game for practically all universities in the United States, probably not Stanford, Harvard, Columbia of the world, right? But you're still in the game for a lot of really strong universities, I'd argue. And so again, once you go over, right, 2 or 3, right, that's usually when I start seeing this type of student really start struggling, right? They start sacrificing their unweighted cumulative, and typically at the worst time, right? 11th grade, the grades start going down, and it's not a good thing. They need the time to properly demonstrate that concern for others and explore that level of learning, right? So to make this really, really practical, let's take a look at some healthy versus unhealthy course pathways. Here today, actually, Tyler helped prepare some of these for a presentation we held way back when. As I mentioned, we're working a lot with the district and Urbanson High. This for me is a very healthy course pathway, and again, you can use this as kind of a scaffolding to compare against your own students, right? Note there are a couple of bullet points here. We're dealing with a high achieving and self-motivated student. So if your student is not self-motivated, they need a constant hand-holding, they're probably not in this, they're probably not going to do well with this, right? But also notice that there's no outside coursework. We're literally saying no self-study for APs, no outside coursework. You don't need it, right? This pathway, I'd say, is sufficient for practically every United States university. All right. If we're talking about, sure, we can start getting nitpicky, right? Harvard, they explicitly said they probably prefer level 4 of a language, right? And by the way, it's the level, not the year. It's the level, not the how many years of language, right? So if I've started ninth grade with Spanish 3, I'm done with my 3 years of language, right? So it's equivalent. That's how it works. It's a very common question we get. But yeah, if we want to get nitpicky and say, okay, sure, Dan, why did you put I don't know, AP Environmental Science here. Maybe I can put AP Spanish. That's fine. Not gonna, or can I do AP Gov Econ instead? That's fine, right? Point is, this is a very healthy course pathway that provides the time for students to rest, to explore themselves, to be a kid, right? And to develop the other quality attributes that they need to get into the best colleges. Here is an unhealthy course pathway, right? Generally. And again, even if the argument is you're looking at grade 11 at those 5 APs is that my student can get A's in all these classes. Even if that's true, I would argue, well, how much time? How much time, marginal, how much time does that cost you? And what time do you not have for other stuff now? Right. And for what other stuff would include things like SAT? What other stuff would even include getting 5s in the APs? Right. I don't remember the last time I had a student with this many APs in this 11th grade course trajectory that got 5s on all those tests. I don't remember. It's been a very long time. In fact, I challenge like even my own teammates if they can find me a student that took that course load and got all 5s. If they did, I can almost guarantee you that either that student lost a lot of sleep or they're heading to Penn or something, which I think we might have had one. Right. Yeah, but that's like of, hundreds, right? So don't just, we have to make sure we provide a healthy environment for students to grow. Oftentimes what I see in these type of projected courses is that there's also additional outside coursework, right? So we're talking about Apex Learning or UC Scout or community college courses throughout the school year or during the summer. Way too much, right? You don't need to do it. In fact, it starts harming your chances of getting into the best universities, right? Because you just don't have the time for other stuff. Really quickly, right, or not too quickly, right? What does a healthy course pathway look for like a student who's not an all-A student, who's an A/B student or a B student, right? This, I'd argue, is a good sample of a balanced course trajectory, right? As you can see, generally averaging about two weighted courses, right? 2 to 3, right, per year. Um, Not overloading in really any specific category, right? And again, no outside courses required. Unhealthy course pathway for A/B student, a little bit too much, right? I'm seeing on average about 4, right, APs, especially in 11 and 12, right? And 10th, as you see the full weightage count, English 10 honors, chemistry honors, AP world history. It's pretty heavy for a student who maybe, doesn't have the skills or the habits, right, to really thrive. And you typically see stuff like this that happens, right? So when we look at, we're gonna just hop over to like recovery after a rough start in ninth grade. This type of transcript here is absolute worst nightmare, right? So you never want to end up in a situation where this is the case, okay? And put yourself in a college's shoes for a moment. You're really gonna not be sure about this candidate. You just have too much doubt, right? Let's say I'm a UC Davis, or let's say I'm a UC Irvine. I'm seeing too many C's here, right? Each C is kind of like a drop of acid on a transcript. It creates a huge hole. That's what I like to think, right? One drop hole, two holes, three drops, there's almost no more transcript left. Avoid C's at all costs, right? If your student is in a position where they got C's in the past, or this last year, or maybe this last semester, right? You have to reduce course rigor, right? To ensure that they don't get any more C's, no matter what, right? I would say that that's SOS, right? So really quickly, just going back, a healthy recovery plan, right, after a rough start, something that's a little bit more mild, right? Let's say they started off, they had a bumpy ride, one weighted course maybe. Even this, I'd be okay if this was non-honors chemistry. It's fine, right? We can start introducing a little bit more, 11th grade potentially, right? Seeing how they did in the 10th, right? That way we have a little bit of weightage to anchor us. We're not completely goose egg on the UC GPA, right, on the weighted stuff, but we're giving the student a chance, right? Especially, and assuming that these courses are in line with the student's own interests. Okay. Again, no outside coursework in the healthy plans here, right? So, what is the case for outside coursework? So, just really quick, I know it sounds like I'm really against outside coursework. I'm not. I actually recommend it all the time. It's very situational. Okay. I think there's two situations where it's used. I think one, you should take outside coursework if your student, um, let's say, didn't do well in a class that they might want to repeat or that they want to kind of mitigate for. We call this grade mitigation, right? So in this example, if you look here, you'll see that in the 11th grade, they got a C in AP Physics 1, right? It's possible for the student to take UC Scout first semester AP Physics 1 to kind of demonstrate to colleges that, hey, I felt like I didn't really properly learn it that semester, right? For whatever reason. It could have been a bad teacher. It could have been maybe I was surprised by the curriculum weight, right? Whatever. I'm going to go ahead and take that outside course, right? Whether it's UC Scout or even a community college equivalent to demonstrate that I really wanted to learn this correctly and I did well, right? Obviously, the goal is to get an A in that outside coursework. So we call this a grade mitigation strategy. And that effort and that final outcome can really, really sway an admissions reader, right? As opposed to a student who just got a C and a B, didn't do anything about it, doesn't provide any additional explanation on the college app, they just left it, right? I'd say that that's especially if I'm thinking about applying for a physics related major like engineering, right? That's, I would say, even though the mitigation might not work, at least you tried, right? And it does look better than someone who just didn't. So that's one case of taking additional coursework. There are other cases, but very other common cases. Okay, maybe I just couldn't fit it. I just, my school wasn't offering it that year, right? So as a result, I decided to take it, over the summer, right? Because I wanted to learn it, right? A common one for this, for instance, is students can't learn economics. They don't typically take economics until 12th grade. So if a student's like, hey, I don't want to wait until I'm 12th grade to take econ, right? Sure, we can go ahead and take an econ course if the student is genuinely interested, right? So there are cases where we recommend outside coursework. It's just it's the tactical case that I'm typically quite against, right? Which is okay, I don't have enough APs. Right? We hear this a lot. I don't feel like I don't have enough, so I have to take more. So that usually comes in the form of self-studying for APs, which by the way is not equivalent to taking the class because a student is not guaranteed to even get a 5 on that test, nor do they have a class to show for it, usually, right? But it's usually that fear-based thinking of I don't have enough on my transcript. Maybe my friend told me this. Maybe my nephew or niece had 14 APs by the time they were 11th grade. That fear-based thing of okay, now I need to go out and find some, right? That is almost never tactically sound, right? So yeah, here it is, right? UC GPA inflation, sure, right? Again, if I want to, again, these can usually be mutually inclusive, meaning sometimes I didn't do well in a class, I want to kind of bump up my UC GPA. We think back to like the 8 max points. I think of a student who, for instance, maybe, only was able to take 2 weighted courses only, right? Across 10th and 11th grade, right? So they have 4 semester extra points for UC GPA. They can earn 4 more. I just met a student yesterday, and this was the situation, right? In her case, I said, hey, I think it makes sense, right? The student is also interested in psychology. I said, well, why don't we go ahead and take a UC Scout psychology course? AP psychology course, right? That allows the student to get A to G credit as well as that additional extra point for weightage, right? So there are cases, right? But let's not get afraid of not having enough, right? I think so. When we think about course selection, let's again focus on unweighted cumulative GPA. How do I position myself to get A's? Forget about rigor. Just how do I position myself to get A's? How do I add rigor relative to my most likely majors, right? And then in addition to that, it's like, okay, if I'm going to add additional rigor, right? One, is the student genuinely interested in it? Do they have confidence that they're going to get an A, right? And if the answer is yes and yes, okay, maybe I might consider taking a push, even though it doesn't align with the major, right? Maybe that might mean taking, I don't know, could be like APES, right? AP Environmental Science, right? Um, Couple of final thoughts, as we kind of linger here into the Q&A. Just words of caution, I guess, right? It's this triple tech, I like to use this word a lot. I've been using it a lot for many years, over a decade. Um, it's generally not a good sign to have a student take 3 technical quantitative STEM courses simultaneously, right? So, for instance, it's very tempting for a pre-med type student in the 11th grade to take AP Calc BC, AP Biology, and AP Chemistry, along with, right, usually AP Lang, right, and who knows what. Uh, that is almost never a good idea. Literally, almost never a good idea. The reason for that is, again, it creates what I call a zero margin situation, right? So if a student drops a B in any of those classes I just stated, especially the STEM classes, there are 3, right? Calc, Bio, Chem, all APs. It disproportionately hurts the student's chances at their goal, which is probably to major in something in pre-science, so bio or chemistry towards college, right? There's no margin for error. And for instance, colleges don't know if a teacher was unreasonable, right? For instance, maybe a student got an 89.9999. Teacher just would not flip it to an A, right? We've seen that before many times. You know, Colleges don't know this. They don't know who's teaching the class, right? They just see a letter grade. And so almost always, right, we recommend taking up to 2 technical or, technically demanding STEM courses at a time. If you're thinking about going to the train of the third, you really got to prove to us from historical data that this is not even a challenge to you, right? You have to show us that in the past, like literally, you were just like walking on water with regards to just maximum weightage. Otherwise, we're probably going to say this is not a good idea. And that's my last thought before we open up to questions. Is there are other factors that influence, course selection. One of them, for instance, is teachers, right? I call them landmines, not just teachers, but a potential landmine is, that your school is, just known for having a difficult pre-calculus teacher, right? For instance, this is very true at a place like Gun High in Palo Alto. And I think even at Mission, for instance. So, students know that if they take right that the weighted pathway, they're practically guaranteed a B, right? There used to be a teacher at American high school, same exact thing. If you ended up with him, and there was a 50-50 chance, right? Either get the easy teacher for AP Calc AB, or you get the insanely hard one. And it was the difference between getting a guaranteed A and a guaranteed B, right? Um, these are these type of situations where we absolutely have to talk through. But again, focus on the basics. What did I say was the most important thing today? It's your unweighted cumulative GPA, right? So if you see a landmine coming, don't walk into the landmine, right? If there's a 50% chance of that landmine happening, right? I would still say let's not walk into that field. Let's just avoid the field, right? Let's take the safer, healthier path, right? And if we really need the weightage, right? Let's say because we avoided landmine, we didn't get the AP Calc, right? Let's go get it elsewhere, right? Let's not put ourselves in a position where I'm going to be miserable for 8, 9 months of my life, right? And so, that is a very common landmine. And then I guess the final landmine is this. This is going to sound kind of funny, but sometimes you just know the student just doesn't have the habits. Let me give you a simple example. A lot of students who go into a weighted math class, even if they got A's in the past, they just don't put in the extra time for practice, right? They consider themselves kind of naturals at math, right? So they've gotten away with it all the way up until about, let's say, like pre-calc, right? Or calc BC. Um, and you as a parent perhaps know this about your student. Yet, it's like we kind of just let our students make their decisions, right? And, I find this happens a lot with boys, especially, right? Especially with underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes at, 16 years old. They think that, just because they're good at math, they're going to be able to walk into a BC Calc class and just get an A, easy, right? Just like all the other math classes before. They themselves are the landmine, right? It's the lack of the discipline. It's the bad habits, right? It's the, being on their screens, on their phones while they're doing homework. It's, not putting in the extra time to actually, do the hard problems when it's not required. That type of situation, if you're dealing with a student that's just not really disciplined or self-motivated, you've really got to be careful with that. And sometimes as parents, we know our children better than they know themselves, right? So having those honest conversations now, early, right, before, you put them in that position or they put themselves in that position, can save you, again, a year long, right, worth struggle of stress and anxiety with testing and grades. Yeah, and again, make sure that your student has margin. If I were to say this, it's if they don't, they just don't have enough time to rest, to do the SAT, to have time for clubs and activities. Even if you're not sure what a student is going to do with that extra hour of time per day, right? It's better to have the extra hour of time per day. Just trust me. Right? And I wish we had a bit more time to actually do a worksheet or some type of interactive component here. But in case you have the time, speaking of time, if let's say you've kind of figured it out. I got the course projecting for my student for next year. This is what I think it's going to be. I challenge you as parents, okay, and students not so much because I don't think I can trust them to actually follow through with this. But parents, let's see, right? Um, I want you to draw out what their weekly schedule looks like, week by week, season by season, for that year. Think about what it might look like, and I actually want you to visualize it. We do this with a lot of our students here, especially for the 11th grade. What you'll find is it's so interesting looking at it, right? Kid gets up at say 7 o'clock or earlier. They go to school for X number of hours. They get back, or maybe they don't. Maybe they have 3 hours of wrestling. Maybe you have 3 hours of track and field, or maybe you have 3 hours of basketball practice, right? They get back home at 6 or 7 in that case, and they have 3 or 4 hours of homework. And we haven't even talked about additional studying yet, right? When are they going to sleep? When do they have time to socialize? And by the way, because they don't, they end up starting to use their phone while they're supposed to be doing their homework. So they don't end at 10. They end up ending at 12 or 1 in the morning. And then the whole thing goes over and over and over again, right? What really helps sometimes is to say, wow, what are we putting our kids through? what are really the expectations here, right? Do I understand what it feels like, right, to be my child as a human being, right? If you find yourself, finding yourself, doing the map of, the schedule, right? Um, just ask yourself, does this look healthy? Does this look sustainable? Is it necessary even? Right? And if it doesn't look healthy, right? That's simple, right? We're all here to promote the wellness of our kids, both long term, but certainly short term. They're not going to make it the long term if they don't make the short term. So, how can we make adjustments, right? Starting with course selection. Let's stop, telling our kids to stop playing the guitar or stop doing the sport or stop doing the thing, right? The art, the sculpture, whatever it is, because I heard you have to take more APs. I'm going to encourage, let's really, before we tell them to stop doing something that is giving them vitality and energy, right? Let's look at the courses and say, hey, is this really beneficial? Because I oftentimes find that it's not, right? We're asking our kids to sacrifice key components of their development in favor of usually fear-based course weightage. um, that is not founded on actual admissions facts and processes. So, I encourage everyone here to really prioritize not just your students' health, but your own health, right? At the end of the day, there's no reason to be afraid, right? And if anything, position your student in a place where they can get A's, give them additional course weightage where they're interested in, and let them be kids. I think outside of that. So thank you everyone for joining. Let's get into some Q&A. I'm curious to see what questions were asked. Yep.
Yeah, so we did have a nice well wish for your healthy return. So I did want to acknowledge that Ishwari sent that message in the Q&A. But we have a really
Thank you.
great
Thank you.
sort of, I would say, not some semi-complex question here.
Yeah.
We've been asked for senior year, can kids start to take less challenging classes, but take classes like drawing? They already take all the classes they're interested in. Can they skip science courses in senior year if they already took all the AP science courses and they don't want to take AP bio in senior year? So this one has about three different components to it. There's kind of a lot to unpack. But this
I
is
love
this
it.
is a
I
really
love
great
complex
question.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll take
Uh,
a stab at it, and I'd love Tyler, who obviously leads our entire college apps division here, to answer too. So I'll give it my best go. If you're planning 12th grade classes, here's what I generally recommend. One, you want your course weightage to equal what your 11th grade was usually, right? Unless your grades were completely bad, like BCs or worse, right? But if you're mostly A's and B's, you want your 12th grade weightage to be equivalent to 11th. In other words, if you have two weighted courses in 11th, right, colleges want to see that you try to continue that rigor into your 12th. Okay. Now, to the nuances. Okay, what if my student doesn't want to take, another science, right? I think it's incredibly dependent on what the student's major is. That's the first thing I would wonder. Like if a student is declaring a major for the arts, I probably not that important for them to, go for AP biology their 12th grade, right? But generally speaking, right, I'd be very cautious to just be like, oh, I don't want to do another science, I'm not going to do it. You hear that a lot from math as well, right? Another tip is, a lot of students ask if they could just TA. Hey, I want to take it easy. I don't want to take 6 classes. I'm going to TA. Not a good look, right? Colleges will look at that and be like, okay, this kid's going to start slacking off. And just one last thing I just want to mention, right? A lot of people say 12th grade grades don't matter. Well, let me tell you something. Two reasons why they might, big time. Number one, if you get two C's in the same class. So first semester C, second semester C. A school like UCLA will potentially rescind you, right? Meaning if you get into UCLA off, and they see that you got two C's in the same class, it's grounds for rescinding, right? If you get a D, right, in any class, your 12th grade, that's typically grounds for reconsideration as well. So meaning a kid can get accepted into a college, and then if the college sees that this student's transcript is starting to go bad into CD territory, the college can literally retract their offer. It's called rescind their offer, right? Um, So that's the last thing I wanted to mention about senioritis. But Tyler, did you have any additional thoughts to add?
Yeah, so I actually see this happen a lot when I'm helping my 11th graders into 12th grade with course selection. They've kind of run through a lot of the classes that make sense, and so classes like drawing, ceramics is a really popular one at some of the high schools these days that are popping up. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, you can take a drawing class in senior year, but like Dan was saying, we don't want to see a significant drop in the challenge that the student is experiencing relative to their course load. Unless, and key is unless that 11th grade year was so challenging for them that they know that they need to pull back in order to pull off a successful 12th grade. Because this, yes, like you were saying, those 12th grade grades do matter. I say this to my students all the time. You can't just think that you're going to AP stack and then get away with looking like you're going to be the best student of all time because you're taking APs down the line. You will have to turn those grades in during your mid-year reports. If you get waitlisted, a lot of the schools
Yep.
request that information. And like Dan said, right, you're in a position to be rescinded. And I have had a couple of students over the years actually get rescinded because they just didn't make the cut. So I do want to actually say one thing about TAing though, which is that sometimes there is no obvious sixth period to fill. And so students will ask about this. My recommendation is if there is absolutely nothing that makes sense for that sixth spot on your course schedule, TAing is fine, provided that you are TAing for a teacher in a course that is actually relevant to your major that you want to have a good relationship with because they might be somebody who's giving a letter of recommendation. That's the one caveat in very specific situations that I would say. All right. And then AP Bio and senior year again, yeah, very much relative to the student's major. So we got another question, which is a very classic question. I do have to say, does Hindi suffice as a language requirement? I have heard that Hindi is not recognized by non-UC colleges, but they are concerned that maybe they are starting a rumor. Yeah. So to answer this question, typically, we can't really control for what universities look out outside of the UC system. If Hindi is registered as a language requirement by the school, typically schools outside of the UC system aren't going to challenge a school for a language that they approved or see approved on a student's transcript. But that being said, Hindi is a language I think that commonly replaces some of the other dialects that students may have taken earlier through middle school, depending on what that is. So that actually tends to be one of the languages that we see replace some of the earlier years. And I've seen this happen in a few situations, but it's always good to just verify generally what non-UC colleges will recognize as legitimate coursework, because especially if you're taking classes outside of the school, that's where it starts to get a little bit dicey.
Yeah, and just some final notes on language. We get a lot of questions on it, so I figured I'll just chime in here too. Again, it's about the level and not the number of years in high school, right? So if a student starts ninth grade with, Chinese 4, there's literally statistically it's impossible to take 3 total years, right, in high school. So again, that's the misunderstanding. It's the level. So it's if you are at a level of, let's say, Chinese 4, that's equivalent to 4 years, right? The UCs require 2. They recommend level 3, right? And the only university that I'm aware of, Tyler, you can let me know if you know others, but that has voiced a preference for level 4 is Harvard, as I've seen. I have not seen another university actually have it explicitly written anywhere on their website that they want 4. I'm sure it's out there, but it's few and far in between. In other words, students, if you're wondering if your student should take 4, basically, whether it's AP Spanish 4 or AP French or AP Chinese. I think the first question I'd ask is actually not related to this. It's just, hey, does the student like it? Okay, if the answer is yes, okay, number two, is the student confident they're going to get an A? Right. Number three, are there any landmines in the way? Right. Is the teacher, notorious for handing out B's and C's? Right. So if all that's clear, it's like, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, if that's the case, but again, we shouldn't feel pressure to push a student into, a level that they're not comfortable with. Right. And we see that a lot in language, I want to say. Like students nowadays are very timid about even taking Spanish 3, I've noticed, because they just find it to be very difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I would say Ivies generally are starting to recommend a fourth year of language lately. It's not something that's widely advertised, but when you look at their admissions data, it's very clear that that is the preference that they are going with. Um,
Got it.
uh, can they choose math classes over science, like double math? So I'm assuming that, instead of taking, let's say, an AP Bio in 11th grade, can we take AP Calc AB and AP Comp Sci, which is starting to become a math requirement course? You can. Does that mean that you should? Not necessarily. And it really is dependent on your student's skill set, their level of what sciences they might have taken already. So I'd say that that's highly situational. You can at certain schools, and I have certainly seen this happen, but that's not necessarily something I almost ever recommend.
Hmm.
Yeah, Dan, I don't you might have something to add to that, but
No, no, I have nothing to add to that. I think that's good. Yeah. What other questions do we have on the list here?
yeah, it looks like we have one more question. Is a third year
Yeah.
of Spanish important for engineering?
I love
Um,
it. It's a very
that
common
is the
question.
question. Yeah.
You want to take this or I can take it. Yeah, whatever, up to you.
Uh, Essentially, the language doesn't necessarily have any bearing on the major itself for engineering. So, if you're looking to apply engineering to any university, my recommendation is that you always go with the recommended language for a major that is highly competitive, right? Because if we're looking at two students side by side, virtually the same transcript, virtually the same extracurricular activities and achievements, that third year of Spanish on a school that recommends a third year of Spanish can be a difference maker. So it's not so much that it's important for the major itself. It's just more important for the overall evaluative process, right? Because again, we're looking at students not just within the context of their success or achievement within their major, but also everything else outside of the major as well, right? Student is not their major. It's just what they're going to be studying, but we're looking for people that are going to contribute to the overall university.
And I think that's a beautiful point to end on. It's what I call the angle, right? I mean, I've mentored students at Berkeley. Obviously, I've mentored students, heading into university. A lot of parents sometimes ask me like, hey, what can I do to help my students set themselves apart? Students will ask me the same. And I like to say that, it's oftentimes not the major stuff. You know, you have an engineer, they think that taking more engineering or more math classes or, getting the C++ certification at the local community college or whatever, they just do all this stuff, right? They might do the research thing related to their major. They do all this major related stuff. And the truth is, that student looks very similar to all the other students who are doing the same exact thing, right? Oftentimes, the stuff that sets a student apart is actually not at all related to the major. In fact, I think it's really cool seeing the intellectual, angle of a kid who, let's say, is an engineering major, but has a completely interesting, take on, I don't know, history of film. It's just, it demonstrates that the student really has something else to provide, right? And I think back to a student in particular, specifically, literally, he eventually went to UC Berkeley. His GPA was, by the way, quite low compared to other candidates out of American high school. He had a 3.7 unweighted cumulative. His at the time that they were also taking the SAT, it was not phenomenal. He had, I think, a 1460, I want to say. But the student watched Iron Man. He created a mechatronic arm that can lift 500 pounds, inspired from the film. He loved old film. He can name directors and actors and actresses and talk about the significance of what that was at the time to culture and history. He had a depth to him, right? He was on the swim team, not the captain, but he demonstrated leadership by basically standing up for the kid who was being bullied by the fastest swimmer, right? You know, that's the type of student that I think is like, wow, okay, this kid doesn't have a leadership title. He, isn't, the strongest academic, but he has this other stuff, right? He's different. And so with regards to Spanish, for instance, I'll end it with this. What I like to say is, okay, if a student gets the 3 years recommended, right? Sometimes the debate is, okay, should I go to 4, right? Oftentimes I'm dealing with students nowadays who don't really speak the language, right? You go to 4, it's all listening and speaking, right? So naturally they're in that position of they don't think they can do that well, but they heard that it kind of matters, right? So what I like to say is, look, if you're not confident, right, in your ability to excel in that class, to thrive in that class, right? Let's not take 4. But hey, what if we use Spanish in the real world? Right? You could be an engineering major, but what if you put yourself in a position where you can volunteer, right, with, let's say, native Spanish speakers, children who are in the 6th grade at 2nd grade reading level in English, right? You do that, I guarantee you, one, you're going to learn a lot more Spanish than you ever did. Two, you're going to put yourself in a position of great leadership potential, right? Because you're going to challenge yourself for sure, right? Not just in the language, but how do you instruct in a language that's not, someone's native, right? And it is different. I don't see many engineers with that bit on their resume. Now, I'm not saying that, oh, just because this looks on a resume, you should do it. I'm just saying that, when you think about classes in general, if you can take what you learn in the class and you can apply it to the real world, whether it was, the kid named Nathan who built a mechatronic arm, right? They can lift 500 pounds. Or it's the kid who took the Spanish 3 or whatever it was, and they took it into their community and used it to help somebody, right? That oftentimes looks a lot better than taking the next level up or to double in math or to double or triple in engineering coursework, right? And so, I think it's a beautiful thing to end on. I think, not only do you get the angle of differentiation, but you get that real world contribution, right? And there's something I learned when I was in high school, but as I'm working with high schools for the past, 16 plus years, that's the thing that makes them come alive is when they can see how the things that they learn in class, right, and they can use it in the room. That's when things really come alive, and that typically shows up in the college application as something that is truly different. So, yeah, I think we're on time. Tyler, do we have any other questions, or are we pretty much good to go?
It doesn't look like there are any other questions in the chat today, but
Great.
yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. But if you want to chat with me, just shoot me an email. It's Tyler at Ready Edge Go, and I'll be happy to connect.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining. And yeah, share the wisdom to the broader community. That's what we're all about. And we'll be back soon for another masterclass. Thank you.